And I see that our opening plenary speaker is here, Dr. Mason. We welcome you.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Morning. So I have the honor of introducing Dr. Mason. Dr. Bonnie Mason has dedicated her career to advocating, educating, and empowering her fellow physicians nationwide. In January 2020, Dr. Mason joined the ACGME as Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Dr. Mason was responsible for supporting efforts to address harassment, discrimination, and other forms of mistreatment in the GME learning environment. During her time there, Dr. Mason primarily led the design, development, and implementation of the ACGME's Equity Matters, a 10-year continuous learning and process improvement initiative in DEI and anti-racism that actively engaged over 1,000 members of the GME community and specialty associations in education, peer advising, and solution development with the goal of definitively addressing disparities, racism, and achieving health equity in their respective environments. More recently, Dr. Mason joined the American College of Surgeons as the inaugural Medical Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Dr. Mason will champion the importance and value of a diverse and inclusive environments and support the development of a vision of effective strategy to create a culture of DEI within the American College of Surgeons. Dr. Mason founded the Nth Dimensions, a non-for-profit organization which has exposed more than 1,000 medical students from 80 US medical schools to the field of orthopedic surgery. Dr. Mason, in partnership with fellow physicians, developed a comprehensive business of medicine and financial curriculum for young physicians called Beyond the Exam Room. We are excited to welcome Dr. Bonnie Mason to join us as the opening plenary speaker, giving us her talk titled Implementing Equity in Graduate Medical Education. Welcome, Dr. Mason.
Thank you so much, Dr. Smith, Teresa. I would like to thank you for the generous invitation to serve as the plenary speaker for this morning's symposium. And I really want to give kudos to SUNY Downstate overall for having the vision and foresight. If this is our third year doing this symposium, that means you are at the cutting edge and kind of forefront of leading this work in a meaningful and sustainable way. So I'm really, really glad, Teresa, that we were able to meet when I was serving as Vice President of DEI at the ACGME. And certainly I want to give a warm shout out to President Riley, whom I've known for years. President Riley was student body president then at Morehouse School of Medicine, where we matriculated in medical school. And I saw him talking about modeling professionalism. And I said, I want to be just like him when I grow up. And sure enough, I was able to be elected as student body president 3 years later at Morehouse as well. So we like following in the footsteps of those who lead. And I appreciate being here this morning. So, and I'd like to thank the dean and all of the faculty and residents who are here today as well, and the staff for supporting me and being really patient with me, not even with being able to be here today. So this morning, as a preface to the exciting agenda that's set out for today, I'd like to start with really just some overall tenets of the work we all do in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I love the theme about around professionalism, because what we want to do is move through not just what we need to know, but how we can integrate and implement the tenets of professionalism in the work that we do on a daily basis. And I'm really just pleased to be here to share some of my thoughts, experiences, and the benefits of some missteps of the observations that I've made in being in the DEI space for 20 years at least, matriculating through orthopedic surgery as a resident prior to any work duty hour restrictions, and then also founding a nonprofit which worked to develop our young people to be competitive applicants in a very minimally diverse field. So I'll be sharing some of these concepts with you today, and I have no disclosures. I'd like to level set the room and set our thoughts around, really defining the relationship between diversity, equity, and inclusion. I have some suggestions on some implementation principles that should sit at the core of any of the equity practices that we look to implement. You're going to hear from several people today across the agenda who will be talking about inclusivity and approaching our work through communication, safety, and leading with love. So, there are some core principles that I think can belie any of the work that we're doing in this space for several reasons, and that's such that we could do this work safely and without causing harm. We'll contextualize equity practices in GME and highlight some of those practices as well. So as we've heard today, our overall goal is to really build environments, learning and clinical environments that are safe, inclusive, and equitable in GME, but of course, across all of healthcare. But it's going to require a few steps for us to get there. So we want not just to create this environment, but we want to do so meaningfully and sustainably to make sure that the changes that we implement are not just performative, meaning one time, one touch, but we want to implement transformational change, which is both meaningful and sustainable. Well, how do we do that? We'll accomplish this by taking responsible action. So while we can be very enthusiastic about the work that we do, and we can go right out here and we can build, an anti-racism course or do some unconscious bias training, we want to make sure that we're taking these actions through a trauma-informed lens such that we are not causing harm in our efforts and our intent to do well. So that responsible action takes some skills building and training that we'll talk about. And then on the back end, we have to and we must implement means and methods, processes that will keep our institutions and then keep us as individuals responsible and accountable to the commitments that we've made in this space. Accountability is key as we work to build out a body of equity practices across the globe. And one equity practice as an individual that each one of you, I would like to invite you to take, is that when we start having conversations around this DEI space, anti-racism, professionalism, integrated space, that we start to set the tone that we want this to be a safe and equitable culture, conversation, interaction, or interface. One of the things we can do at the beginning of our meetings, especially around this type of content, and once again, this is an equity practice that maybe you'd like to adopt, is that we verbally share that we are accepting, we're moving into this room knowing that this content is complex and challenging, which thereby may cause some discomfort. Let's acknowledge that, please. Let's acknowledge that this can cause some unrest amongst our colleagues, but in acknowledging that we are also saying that's why we have to have a safe and trauma-informed space where everybody comes as active and respectful listeners and learners with a huge dose of cultural humility. Notice I did not say cultural competence. Cultural humility is our self-admission that we may not have all the answers about the lived experience of another person, another population within the context of our environment. And with that humility, we can all come to the table willing to change. And in making that commitment to change, we can be patient, we can move towards this open growth mindset that will encourage everyone to adopt. Also in setting the culture, we want to make sure that people are approaching this session, our leadership development session today, with an air of curiosity, just like we were first-year medical students. One of inquiry and understanding that the work in equity, building professionalism, and that interface is relationship-based. This is not transactional. This is a longitudinal approach to building relationships, and it requires that we come to the table with both an individual growth mindset, but also, as demonstrated by the symposium, that this is an organizational growth mindset. Now, we can also set the stage about what this is not. This is not an environment where we want to compete with one another, judge one another, confront, and once again, make this a one-time, one-touch transaction. But we want to move forward in this work in a way that is inviting everyone to come to the table, ask questions, not feel that they will be accused of being a racist or sexist in the environment, but coming with earnest questions from a place of just honest inquiry and curiosity. And today, I'll be sharing several equity practices with you. And I would like you to think about maybe one new equity practice that you can take away from today's session as well. I'm an action-based person. I like us to have an action-based approach in our problem solving in DEI. And so let's start with really making sure we understand the relationship between diversity, equity, and inclusion. And one of the things I want to make sure of is that we're not just assuming at the table, at the forefront, that everyone at the table has a full understanding. So it never hurts to revisit some of your core definitions as we move forward. And so the relationship, as we know, many of the efforts in the early 2000s and also in 2010 really just focused on increasing the numbers of diverse candidates and faculty within our environments. But we learned that that is not enough. We now understand that this space that we invite our diverse learners into, our diverse faculty, must be equitable for all. And in implementing these equity practices, then we will create an environment that is inclusive for everyone as well. And that is the rising tide that lifts all boats. In order to do so, we have to have environmental readiness on every level. That's one of my it's just like a rock in my shoe, because we want to do this work and we're so eager, but we have not always taken the time to prepare. But before we get to environmental readiness, we want to make sure that when we are looking at, just the keys to diversity, and this is just a screenshot of the many, close to 70 authors that I worked with and built teams around during the ACGME Equity Matters implementation and launch. We wanted to invite people from every background with any number of intersectional identities to come to the table and share their expertise in some aspect of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And what we want to know and walk away with today is that we want to make sure that everyone is represented. So that is the core of diversity, because there are different lived experiences of each one of these individuals, once again, across all of their intersectional identities. And when you are building a team, when you are building a program, a residency, cadre, or even a faculty, you want to make sure you have diverse voices, which will bring diverse solutions and problem solving capabilities to the table. And that's when we have our greatest wins. And that is borne out in the literature. Also in the literature is a definition of equity. And this may be the one single slide that I'd like everyone to, even if you would like to screenshot this, this would be ideal. Because Dr. Kamara Jones, who is, for all intents and purposes, one of the gurus of the work that's been done for decades in the racism and anti-racism educational space and in public health, she defines equity as the assurance of the conditions of an optimal educational practice and clinical environment. Think about this as the workplace for everyone in the workforce. Learners, faculty, staff, leadership. So if we think about it and just close your eyes for a minute, equity is the assurance of the optimal workplace for everyone in the workforce. Well, how do we achieve that? We achieve that through a three-pronged approach as suggested by Dr. Jones, and I found this to be true, where we accept that we have to value all individuals, voices, and populations equally. That's first. If we haven't heard from someone, how do we know that we are honoring their lived experience, that we are creating an environment that is supportive? Once again, we can't just presume that we know what they need. We also have to recognize and rectify historical and current injustices. If we take an ahistorical approach to building our equity practices, we are likely to repeat and worsen some of the trauma that has been caused in our environments by well-meaning individuals. And then finally, we have to provide resources according to need, without judgment, recognizing that everybody comes to the table, once again, with a different set of information, opportunities, and provisions once they reach our doorstep, either as a student, resident, or faculty member, or even as a leader. So we have to be willing to extend the resources necessary to make sure that they are successful in the space that we have invited them into. And one really quick, another important point about equity, equality and equity are not the same. So if we take a look at this, this graphic where we're looking at 3 different types of plants, and the resource provision centers around light and hydration. If we look on the left, all 3 plants, despite their differing needs for both light and hydration, are receiving equal amounts. If we look on the right, we see that the cactus, which needs more light, less water, is receiving its resources according to its needs. The rose, medium light, medium hydration, and then the fern, lower light and maximum hydration. So if we think about being able to provide resources according to what people need versus an equal share, then we'll see that each one of these plants on the right will thrive and proliferate, which is what we want from our residents, our faculty. What do they need in order to be sustainable, grow, and proliferate in our educational and clinical environments? And so once again, another huge takeaway that I like to share at each one of our talks. And what results is an inclusive environment that is safe, because it is the result of well-designed, accountable, and measured equity practices for diverse populations, which wind up benefiting everyone in the workplace. Everyone can now show up feeling their most authentic selves. They feel that they have access to resources, and they feel a sense of belonging. So this is that inclusive environment is where we want to end, because there's safety in this space. There's place for people to ask questions, to make mistakes, and not fear that they will immediately be put on remediation or immediately be put on the track for attrition and withdrawal. So we want to make sure that this is the continuum of the 3 elements of DE&I that I wanted to bring to the table and tie those 2 inextricably together moving forward. So if we're looking at implementing equity practices as another prong of professionalism, once again, we want these equity practices, things that you're going to do as an individual, as a department, as an institution. We want these practices to be longitudinal and sustainable. The longitudinal part means that these are also growth opportunities that build on each other. These practices should be built to last, incremental, and built as a process. All right, so this level of progress that we're talking about in equity is always process driven. And I have some implementation science suggestions to share with you shortly around this. These efforts and practices must be sustainable, which means we need both human and financial capital. So that means for our leadership, I know President Riley and our dean are on the call. So we need some FTEs, and we need continuous financial resources to support this work on an ongoing basis, because once again, these equity practices, once implemented, will create an environment that includes and sustains all members of our workforce. We have to set some expectations, however. We can accomplish some short-term wins because we can get real busy implementing some equity practices, but we want to be sure that our board members, our stakeholders, our leadership understands that the long-term return on investment is the ultimate goal. The integration of this work into our culture is a long-term strategy. And then once again, approaching the work, any equity practice with a growth mindset, both on the individual level and then also on the organizational level. So when it comes to implementing equity practices, I always, so I was a Girl Scout through high school and was one of the part of one of the first Girl Scout troops that was all African-American in North Georgia back in the late 80s to receive the Gold Award. But I love the motto, be prepared. And so what we want to do is not just go out and do something, but we want to have a strategy where we're fully prepared to implement the work that we're looking for. This is the staged approach that I'm going to recommend belies any equity practice that we look to put into place. We want to make sure, once again, and may end up sounding like a broken record, but it's really important. we want to make sure that whatever equity practices we implement, that it comes from a place of taking time to prepare and to build out the measurement and the accountability processes so that we can make sure that we can adapt as necessary, especially if we've identified areas that just didn't work. So this is going to require that as faculty, as leaders first, and I'm taking this reverse ideation top-down approach where we're not just looking at the learners, particularly those who are from marginalized populations. We're taking responsibility on ourselves to say, you know what, before I build out or implement an equity practice, let me make sure I'm educated and knowledgeable on the numerous aspects of DE&I. Let me not just assume that I know this, because I can tell you that I've been in the DEI space for 20 years before DEI was, a thing, and I still learn in every single session. So let me make sure I am doing and proceeding along this path based on an education, a fund of knowledge that allows me to then become skilled, and receive some additional training so I can take responsible actions, because what I don't want to do as a leader, as a faculty member, is to cause more harm. And then we'll do some assessment and accounting. And this is the instructional design that's based on productivity that I laid out when I built Equity Matters over at ACGME. And I bring it up because I think it's one of the things I'm most proud of in my professional career, because it finally clicked that before we can take action, which is over here in phase 3, which is what we see a lot of people do. And I'm not being critical. I'm just highlighting the fact that before we take action, with unconscious bias training or anti-racism training and things like that, we have to help everyone understand the what and the why. This is even important. Why would anybody even want to come to an anti-racism training if they're not subjected to racism? Why would this be important to me? What's in it for me if I am from, a majority culture? Well, in building this fund of knowledge, we're helping people understand what's important, but also why it's important. So this will allow us to take an informed decision-making approach to moving forward from building that fund of knowledge in phase 1 and moving over to this acceptance phase where, okay, now that I understand why this is important, let me build up the necessary skills and undergo some training before I implement any actionable steps, because again, we don't want to cause harm. And then be willing to reflect and take a look at what we've done, what could we do better, and how do we keep ourselves accountable? This is no different than us making sure our students understand the basic sciences and then make sure they're trained before they go, placing an IV or a chest tube or replacing anyone's knee. And then they are able to come into the operating room, go onto the wards and see, and apply those fundamental, basic and clinical skills to patient care. And then what we do on the back end is we go to M&M. We go to M&M conference and we take a look and see what we did, how we did it, and where we can improve. And so, these equity practices can be adopted by all of us as an individual in GME, by anyone within the workforce as a whole, at the institutional and leadership level, and certainly when it comes to patient-facing care delivery. As an individual, here's the part of the broken record, and it's just a way in that when we're doing this work, no matter how smart we are, how many degrees we have, what can I learn from the work that's being presented today? What can I take away through that lens of cultural humility? Maybe I need to ask a question that I'm afraid to ask. We're working with the Council of Medical Specialty Societies and so many of their leaders, CEOs and CFOs, HR directors were coming to Equity Matters and saying, well, we have some concerns. What if we ask the wrong question? What if we use the wrong language? It takes courage to even voice that fear. So we want to reinforce and give positive reinforcement to those who even come to the stage with a question. Understand that this work is going to take some introspection and reflection, because in this process, we'll receive some new information and we may have to reconcile that with the information with what we thought we knew. And that too can provide a reckoning, an emotional kind of level of upset that I have worked with professionals in positions around, because understanding that maybe what we were taught before may not be the actual reflection of the lived experience of those who are in front of us, means that we have to come to grips with, okay, maybe I didn't know what I thought I knew. So some equity practices, as we've highlighted already today, Dr. Smith, Teresa, stated at the beginning that the group consensus was to call each other by our first names, not presuming that I want to be called by my first name, but asking everyone in the group. That is valuing individuals and populations, all voices equally. The equity practices and setting the stage and culture at the beginning of this talk is also an equity practice. Making sure we take time to pronounce someone's last name. And if we don't have time to do that, ask that person humbly, could you pronounce your name for me, so that I can make sure I pronounce it as well as I can. And please forgive me if I don't pronounce it exactly correctly. We want to share leadership roles on rounds and in our meetings. Who's leading the meeting today? Give everyone an opportunity, if they choose to lead a meeting. We want to approach equity practices, and especially when we are engaging our learners, our faculty, we want to presume excellence versus assuming inadequacy. That's acknowledging our own biases that might lead us to say, well, they're from an underserved community, or they are from a historically Black college or university. You also, with that presumption of excellence, can also attach to that people from underserved communities, people from HBCUs, people from other marginalized populations may bring to the table some unique experiences that everyone can learn from. And so with that presumption of excellence, moving into engaging that person with inquiry, we can learn from each other. We can learn something from everyone. I love speaking to medical students and residents and hearing about their background, hearing about the span of life that they've had to traverse to reach, rounds, to reach this level of engagement on rounds or, in medical school. Because, what I found is that our students who, have really faced some tough times, and even some faculty that I've met recently, I've learned one medical student who actually matched, he's a resident now, but when he was a medical student, he told me that he had housing insecurity, experienced housing insecurity, and was homeless for some time. And so I just, I thanked him for sharing that with me, because I also then was able to reflect on how much resilience that person is coming to the table with, the problem solving skills, the resource navigation that person has had to garner in order to go from being housing insecure to being a medical student was tremendous. That's the type of future leader we want in medicine. But if we don't take the time to acknowledge or to inquire and ask and look to learn from our young people, faculty, leaders, it's always important to have young people around and make sure we are learning from them as well. And they can always give you the next best app that we don't have on our phones. So we want to make sure that we engage our young people as an equity practice. We want to acknowledge any missteps that we may take. We're not used to in medicine being able to acknowledge missteps, but missteps, stepping on landmines, misspeaking, or using someone's name incorrectly, or making an inappropriate assumption, coming back and apologizing is an equity practice that cannot be understated. It helps build trust. It helps, it creates a net of safety for everyone in the environment when you acknowledge your misstep and ask for, when you ask for an apology in front of everyone. It doesn't hurt us. it might make us feel uncomfortable, but it helps way more than it might hurt our ego. So I want to acknowledge if you mispronounce someone's name, or if you mistake someone for the cleaning staff and they're actually a faculty member, or if you made actually an assumption based on inadequacy, that you circle back to that student, resident, or faculty member and say, you know what, I made an assumption that was inappropriate. Can I process that with you ultimately, because I absolutely want to apologize. And then finally, these individual equity practices hold that when we are in our education committee meetings, when we are with each other on rounds, and even if we are out in the evenings, maybe not so much right now, that we hold our colleagues accountable when these equity practices, or when less than inclusive, less than professional language is used, if we see disparate evaluations or penalties being lodged on one resident versus another, one faculty versus another, we're going to have to start speaking up and holding each other accountable in this space as a sound equity practice, excuse me, that we can elevate. That a level of accountability will help us move through the challenges that we have and that we're facing right now. But it's also a key measure of accountability. In the workforce, when we are thinking about our physicians, our clinicians, the entire healthcare team, students, residents, administrators, and staff, we want to think about some of the equity practices that we can employ. I would suggest that, one of the things we do is track the equity practices that we're launching as an institution, and make sure that this accountability piece right here in the center square, excuse me, a rectangle, is a key part of all of the work that we're doing. The way you can track workforce equity practices, I like to think and compartmentalize on a 30,000-foot view. If we have equity practices, if you take a look at the first column, that fall into, let's determine whether they fall into a recruitment exercise, a retention exercise, education practice, or a practice that centers around data and accountability. We can then start to map and matrix all of the work that's being done such that we can track and understand our impact, be able to quantify that impact and take it back to our board of directors, back to Dr. Riley, and to our leadership to request more resources be allocated to the work we're doing. But we do have to be this strategic with the work and the equity practices on an overall level, because what we don't want to do is just have a lot of programs going where we're really busy, but we're not taking care of the business of ensuring that these practices can be implemented in a sustainable and meaningful way. I did ask Dr. Smith, Teresa, about some of the work that's being done here at SUNY Downstate. And I just want to congratulate you being on the receiving end of some of the, well, I'll share that with you in a second, but just congratulations on your DEI House Staff Council, where so many of our trainees are engaged. The AOA Diversity Initiative, which increased the number of those from minoritized populations who are in AOA, which has been a policy and a structure that was built unintentionally, but that one that proved to be exclusive. And then also the overall recruitment efforts at both the UME and GME level overall. So congratulations. And that's one of the reasons why SUNY Downstate, your entire system was recognized or will be recognized by the ACGME with the 2022 ACGME Barbara Ross Lee DEI Inclusion Award. And it really was an honor to be on the selection committee last year when you all submitted your application. And so now you are modeling some of the work that we want to see institutions implement across the country. So congratulations. And speaking of departmental equity practices, and as I wrap up, this is an opportunity to take it to audit and review all of the policies, practices, resource allocation that is being devoted to creating safe, equitable, and inclusive environments within your sphere of influence, as well as looking at, how can these equity practices support the ongoing and necessary crossing of the finish line, which means our residents our students, residents, and faculty receive the certifications, credentials, and licenses that they need successfully in order to matriculate into the workforce. So with that, I will wrap up. This is an invitation for everyone to think about what type of equity practice you might be able to implement. You want to think about laying this goal out in a smart, from the SMART goal construct, one that is specific, measurable, action-oriented, reasonable, and time-sensitive. That's the physician educator in me and coach. So, think about what that action is that we can move forward with. And as we, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me via any one of these vehicles on social media. I have both of my emails there. And I'd like to thank Teresa, you and the organization committee, again, everyone here at SUNY Downstate for having me here today. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to take those. Thank you.
Thank you. A virtual round of applause, Dr. Mason. Thank you very much. That was wonderful. It was a beautiful gift of pearls. So thank you so much. I invite everyone to please put your questions in the chat. We will start there, and we do have some time, so we'll be able to unmute. And I will start off. I'll be the brave soul to start off with a question. So Dr. Mason, you talk about this apology and missteps, which I thought was a wonderful, wonderful pearl. How do you recommend, for example, if a faculty member, recognizes that they may have offended someone or maybe have shamed someone in public, how do you recommend that they publicly then apologize? It's pretty difficult. Oftentimes we're taught as faculty to take individuals aside and maybe acknowledge the misstep that way, or to try to, debrief about what happened. But how do you then recommend that they do the public apology?
That's a critical opportunity for us to set the culture in our particular space. So let's say that we may have harmed someone unintentionally. So this isn't about the intent, it is about impact. And if we have to recognize that if the harm was done in front of others, the impact did not just land on that person that was on the receiving end. Just like secondhand smoke, everyone in that environment witnessed what happened. And that is also then the environment where the discussion needs to happen. And let me also say, and I learned this from my colleague, Dr. Sunny Nakai, your apology does not have to happen right then, because many times, number one, we may not know that we caused some harm. And number two, we might not have the words. We might not have our words together yet. So what we want to do is take some time to process maybe what happened once it's brought to your attention. Call a colleague and say, hey, I think this happened, or it's brought to my attention that this happened. I really would like to address this. This is part of our cultural integrity muscle that we're building, that I want to address this with the group. And we have to be able to go back to the, let's just say it happened on rounds and say, listen, everyone, I said something that I now know caused harm to Dr. X. Dr. X, I apologize. I have taken some time to go back, and once it was brought to my attention that happened, to do some reading, to learn a little bit more about why what I said was harmful. I've spoken to some of my colleagues. So number one, I would like to apologize to you in front of everyone, because I did not mean to harm you, but it did in fact cause harm. And I want you to know that that is not who I am. That's not what my role is here, but my role is also here to learn and grow in this space as well, which is what I'd like to do. Maybe if you could please accept my apology, I would greatly appreciate it. That's how you do it. It happened to me within the last 6 months. And so I really would like to let everyone off the hook to say, listen, it can happen to all of us. This is not something that we are all well versed in, but in practice, I misnamed someone. And a week later, I mean, I just felt horrible about it. I went back to that same meeting and I apologized for misnaming him. I just called him a different name without looking at the screen, you know, in his square. And I apologized for that. And then my team came back and said, wow, we didn't expect you to do that. We've never heard anyone apologize before because we usually just move through it and keep going. But even the person wrote back and said he really appreciated the acknowledgement of the misstep, but the acknowledgement, and that's valuing him as a person, to say his name is important.
So along those same lines, actually, Dr. Wilodi is asking the question, should we ask the person if they're comfortable with the apology in public, or should we proceed as you just kind of articulated?
Asking never hurts, okay? So that's the cultural humility. And that's owning that we might not be getting this right, but I wanna take some steps towards rectifying what happened, right? And that doesn't mean that I know exactly how to do this and I'm not perfect, but I think being able to live with that imperfect action and being able to take imperfect action as physicians, and we've been in that space before. We've all had to, try to start an IV or, place a central line without, being 100% sure. We have to be able to move through that discomfort in the same way. And because we have moved through it before, we can apply it here as well. Taking care to, own our own humility, but honor that other person's identity. And I think when you say that, I mean, that's how you problem solve, through communication.
We have a few other questions, if I may. Dr. Camille Clare, our chair of OBGYN, asks, can you speak on the role of intent versus impact?
Absolutely. So, hi, Camille. So this moves through that paradigm that someone is a nice person. Okay, so nice can still, by commission or omission, cause harm. So we want to move through the fact that all of us, I think, moving into healthcare, I mean, we came in well-intended people, but that does not mean that our words and our actions can't land sourly on another person, a patient, a student, a resident. And it's not our intent for any of us, I think, from any of us, for that to happen. But we have to recognize that there's a difference. And just because you didn't mean to step on somebody's toe doesn't mean their toe isn't broken. So that's the difference between intent and impact. That pain, the harm, and the resulting action, has hurt someone. So can we acknowledge that, buddy tape the toe, apologize and move forward, but also be very careful not to step on that person's toes again. And the way we have to do that is by taking it on ourselves to, become educated, learn, and not just presume we know how to not step on their toe, but to take requisite, that's that education piece, the formative piece, to make sure we know what we should or should not do so we won't cause harm again.
Another question, if I could, from Angela Kerr. She says, you also mentioned holding colleagues accountable as well. This is also difficult to call them on a misstep in public. How do you address this?
So that conversation may not start in public. That may start in our faculty meetings. That may start in our education committee meetings. We have to start normalizing what we expect from one another in terms of our faculty responsibilities to equity, to inclusion. And so at the very beginning, I believe that's Angela, at the very beginning of this session, I had a slide where I showed setting the stage, setting the culture of equity. We may want to start our faculty meetings, our education committee meetings, with some of the key things that we want to bring to the table, key aspects of equity, inclusion, leadership, and accountability that we want to highlight in every meeting, why we want to highlight those, so that we can start building the expectation that we can start holding each other accountable, and then build in some normalcy to point and counterpoint, not confrontation and judgment, but saying, you know what, this is my point of view. Who may have another point of view? And have that shared constructive communication by design, such that we can get to an endpoint where we are holding each other accountable in our decision making. Because remember, we're remembering that, these are young people's lives that we have put on the table. And the reason this is so important, as I found it at the ACGME, when we looked at withdrawal and dismissal rates of residents who were from underrepresented backgrounds and from marginalized communities, in some specialties, there was a 6-fold overrepresentation of residents who withdrew or who were terminated if they were from, if they were Black or if they were Latino. That was across specialties. Family medicine, anesthesia, orthopedic surgery was the worst, unfortunately, my specialty, even general surgery. And so that information is starting to be tracked, but that's why holding each other accountable, maybe even doing faculty audits on our evaluations, making sure that we are even evaluating our residents in an equitable fashion through a lens of equity, and not more harshly evaluating our marginalized residents, or those who are from marginalized backgrounds, I should say, than others. So these are the types of accountability steps that we can start taking and measuring, and then normalizing in our faculty meetings, such that when we have those, we may have a public showing, that even if we don't hold them accountable at that moment, that we come back in front of our community and make sure we can take steps towards taking those accountable measures. Our residents and our students are watching how we manage this, or not.
Okay, I think we have time for at least one more question. Can we take that last question?
Sure. So we have Dr. Ellen Berkowitz from our psychiatry colleague and is another associate dean. If a student or resident or junior trainee experiences microaggressions from a senior faculty member, what would be best manner to address directly in a respectful approach? Or should it be escalated to a trainee senior advocate supervisor?
Right, so this is that reverse ideation approach where we're holding leadership responsible. So thank you, Dr. Berkowitz, Ellen, for that question. We have to be willing, okay, these are new permissions we're putting on the table, okay? So we didn't always have permission to hold each other accountable. So, and I'm gonna ask Dean Brunicardi, did I say your name correctly? And I don't wanna just keep calling you the Dean.
Yeah, that was perfect. Thank you.
Wonderful. Okay, so Dean Brunicardi, Charles, we want to be able to say, listen, as Teresa, if Teresa comes to you and says, I have a senior faculty member who, is casting aspersions or has cast some microaggressions, can we bring this senior faculty member, well-respected, probably really clinically adept person in for some reshaping and mitigation of these behaviors? Letting a senior faculty member or allowing them to continue to behave badly in our new equitable and inclusive space is congruent with what we say our values are. So we as leaders have to be able to bring that person in as respectfully, to your point, as possible, but still hold them accountable and say, listen, we cannot allow this type of behavior to continue because it is causing harm, maybe in ways that you don't recognize, but we can't continue to perpetuate some of the work that you're doing. And once we know better, we have to do better. So this is us, we're at that threshold. Now that we know better, we have an opportunity to do better. And that's how we can invite them in, by calling out their actions, not necessarily calling them out as a person, but we can call out actions. And that is also an equity practice that moves people through transformation and better behavior versus just ignoring it, pretending it didn't happen, and having that student who was the target of the microaggressions and those who witnessed it feel unsafe. Because if it's not addressed, we are perpetuating harm. We are undermining environmental safety and equity. Those students are not going to perform well, and you might even start to see a downward spiral and trending because that, and even a pulling back, because now the residents or the students just do not feel safe. And how many of us can perform maximally when we don't feel safe?
Absolutely, I agree. And I can attest that Dean Brunicardi has been supportive of that. And in fact, that's, one of the reasons why we're doing this today is to try to create these cultures and a safe space for everyone to have these discussions. So we appreciate him and his support and setting the stage and the tone. So thank you, Dean Budacardi, or Chuck, as he likes to be called. So thank you very much, Dr. Mason, Bonnie. We greatly appreciate having you. And this is the start of the day, very powerful discussion that we hope to continue throughout our day and our series, and really having what could be seen as really difficult conversations. And it's nice that we're creating this tone of a safe space for us all to learn, because that's how we get better. And we greatly appreciate your pearls of wisdom and for you joining us today. It's been an honor to get to know you in my short tenure as a DIO and the work that you do. We're having a group chat and we are all girl fans of yours. And perhaps after the pandemic, we can take you out to lunch. So thank you so much. And good luck to you on your new role in the American College of Surgeons. We are very excited to see the work that you'll do there. You did a wonderful job at the ACGME, so thank you very much.
And thank you for having me. I love going out to lunch with my girls, so I'm happy to take you up on that. And I figure if we can, make some headway at ACGME and now with the College of Surgeons, if we can make some headway in surgery, then we can make headway anywhere. And I'll be coming back to you all for support and additional cheerleading. This work requires us to do this together. And so collectively we can make some meaningful change. So thank you, everyone. Have a great symposium. Thank you.
Thank you so much.